organizations. I would like to recognize the presence of Dr. Luvis Seke from AUDA NEPAD, as well as our very own Dr. Joanne Satella, and to everyone else who's made it this afternoon to our meeting. Feel most welcome, and we look forward to your insightful comments. So I'll just invite Obed to come in, but before I do so, kindly allow me to take us through Obed's background and just to know who Obed is. All right, thank you very much. Obed Kisi holds a Master of Science in Environmental Science and Policy and Management, and is currently a PhD candidate at the Institute of Environment in Sanitation Studies at the University of Ghana. He has over 10 years experience in quantitative and qualitative research methods, consulting for high-level projects that are funded by international organizations such as the ELRA Humanitarian Innovation Fund of the UK, UNESCO Ghana, Plan International, and Star Ghana Foundation. He's part of an intergovernmental technical data advisory committee working to streamline and improve data collection and collision, as well as information management within the climate change and WASH sector. Mr. Asamoah has an enormous experience in action research, development advocacy, organizational change and development, project management, and stakeholder mapping. He's a focal person with the Green Climate Fund in South Korea since 2019, working towards development and uptake of climate change research. As the head of programs of the Research and Grant Institute of Ghana, Mr. Asamoah has acted as a focal person for development partners, notably DFID on research, education, and development issues in Ghana. His research interest is in the area of nationally determined contributions, financing for SMEs, circular economy, environmental management, and eco-disaster risk reduction. He's also one of our ARIN Fellows, and we were really happy and privileged to take him through the NDC FFP Academy that took place in May, right here in Nairobi. So Mr. Obed, you're very much welcome. Feel free to start us off.
Okay, thank you very much, Juliet. Good afternoon from Accra. As Juliet introduced me, my name is Obed Asamoah Kisi. I'm currently a PhD student with the Institute of Environment and Sanitation Studies at the University of Ghana. And I thank ARIN for this opportunity to share thoughts on something which has actually intrigued my mind concerning the NDCs and how challenges regards to how we are able to implement it going forward, especially with COP27 coming up, how researchers and policymakers can address their minds to the challenges we currently face globally. For developing countries, the enormous challenge we face as we head towards COP27 and as 2030 approaches. And so this is an area that I would like us to discuss. It's more of a discussion than my own work. It's just a thought based on some preliminary research I've done concerning the area that I want to share with all of us. So I will begin my presentation. All right. I hope we can all see the screen.
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you very much. So my topic is on prioritizing the nationally determined contribution for developing countries in COVID era, why we need a new metrics to rank our policy actions. And I actually thought about this area based on the fact that most of our NDCs are quite ambitious, and we actually set the NDCs based on our national needs and our priority areas. And so all countries are supposed to present their needs and their national priorities based on things they think they can achieve within a specific time. However, these NDCs, even though we actually develop them based on our national needs, also is likely to be impacted by external factors. Sometimes things we can't control and things which may actually affect countries' ability to be able to achieve the NDCs. For example, Ghana's INDCs that we submitted, we actually had an amount of 22 billion as the requirement to achieve the NDCs. But over the years from 2016, we realized the expectation of raising that 22 billion was a challenge. So we actually had to be a little more moderate and in reducing the amount from 22 billion in our INDCs to just a little under 10 billion, which is around 9 billion for our new NDCs, updated NDCs. And this goes to show that sometimes how we project how we're able to achieve the NDCs may not actually be materialized based on external factors we can't control and we can't predict, based on a lot of conditions that happen within countries or globally, which may affect a lot of countries' ability to achieve the NDCs. I could also mention a typical case of Kenya, where between the time they submitted their INDC, which they wanted all their financial resources to be conditional, which means it should be based on external supports. And their new updated NDCs, where they are requiring just where they are requiring 13% internally generated funds to address the NDCs. So it goes to show that as countries move on from the INDCs to the updated NDCs, and as they also project to update the NDCs, a lot of external factors or a lot of things may happen within those periods that we may not be able to control. And so it is important that as we think about how we actually have updated our NDCs and submitted, we begin to think about how we can rank them based on the needs that we have. Even though those NDCs are priority areas, how do we ensure that with all the challenges that we face and with limited resources, how do we ensure that we rank them? So I'll begin by looking at our current pertinent conditions that we face globally. Now, prior to COVID, which is 2020, where it became a global pandemic that we all faced. In terms of climate financial flow, developed countries managed to just raise just a little under 80 billion to address what they call climate change, and which is just below the 100 billion which was promised. So even before COVID, the amount of financial flow that we expected, it was just below what developed countries were able to mobilize to address to help developing countries address climate change. Now, there are indications that moving forward, even before COVID, the 100 billion was not realized. Moving forward, there are indications that this, even the 79 billion may actually reduce as we move post 2020. And so there is a call for new approach about how we can prioritize our climate financial flow to address important issue in the short to medium term. And that is what is very critical now. The short to medium term, how do we ensure that with all the challenges we face and with limited resources, we are able to address those pertinent issues relating to our NDCs. Now, globally, the current impact of climate change has been felt, the current impact of COVID, has been felt in all countries, as we all experience it sometimes in our general life and in our institutions where we work and all that. The IMF said there has been a drop in GDP, global GDP, relative as a result of COVID, and it has actually resulted in most countries struggling to grow as they expected. For developing countries, there has been a drop, which is a negative growth in GDP as at 2020. In terms of revenue generation, there has been over 220 billion loss in revenue, which actually puts majority of citizens within developing countries into the poverty, the poverty line, making those without social protection very vulnerable to impact of socioeconomic systems. And also, over 200 million people have been pushed into acute food insecurity as a result of the impact of COVID. And that is the current situation we are facing now relative to how COVID has impacted as developing countries and on the global stage. Okay, so this is a data I put from the IMF relative to deficits for sub-Saharan Africa, which are normally most vulnerable when it comes to the impact of climate change. And I don't know whether you can see the data is quite long. So, but the general trend is that except few countries which managed to actually keep their deficits the same pre-COVID and during the COVID era, most of the countries have higher deficits. And it goes to show that COVID has actually impacted on most of developing countries' economies. If you take a case of Ghana, my own country, if you even look at this data, my own country has been the worst when it comes to budget deficits. We are spending more than we can even generate, and we are before COVID were at least doing very well, around 6%, but after COVID, we are hovering around 14%, which is way too high, above the recommended of deficit of, let's say, less than 4%. And that is very critical that developing nations are not able to generate enough to spend, and they are overspending on their budgets, making a huge deficit on their their budgets. And this is quite a critical area that we should be able to look at going forward, that this is the challenge that is currently persisting relative to our current economic conditions. There is also another data showing how much is happening relative to revenue and how revenue is expended. And a little glance through the data shows that a lot of the countries there are all developing countries, spending more of their revenue to service their debts. If I look at Ghana, we are spending more than half of our revenue on debt servicing, which means the revenue we generate, we are actually spending almost half, more than half on debt servicing. The rest will go into statutory payments, We have other statutory funds that we are supposed to send those monies into, and they are also wages and salaries, public sector wages and salaries government has to deal with. So if you look at this data, it shows that throughout this process, a lot of the revenue goes into debt servicing. So government is actually limited in how much it can actually allocate to revenue or to projects relative to, let's say, climate NDCs or anything related to adaptation or mitigation projects. Government don't have that kind of leeway, because even with the limited resources they generate, half goes into debt service and the rest has to pay workers. And so government will have to resort to more borrowing, and it becomes a vicious cycle, and it actually hampered government's ability to be able to address some of the NDCs that we have set for ourselves. And this is showing how the fact that COVID is actually affecting, we are already struggling, and COVID has exacerbated the situation. Said that no matter how we try to address some of our socioeconomic development, in the short to medium term, we will continue to actually have this kind of challenge related to how we address our priority areas related to the NDCs. And it's time we actually have to be real. For example, Ghana, we decided that we will spend 40% of the 9 billion that we require to address our NDCs. The 40% will actually come from governments, but the reality is that governments may not, or will not, I should say in the short to medium term, be able to mobilize that 40% to address the NDCs. And if you look at other countries too, maybe Kenya is spending close to 30% of their revenue, and they have actually moved from zero conditional to about 13%, where they decide to use internally generated funds to address the NDCs, and they are also servicing their debts. So will Kenya be able to do that? It's a question for all of us to ponder over. And so because the impact of climate change affect developing countries most due to our vulnerability, between mitigation and adaptation is more of relevant to developing countries, where we want to reduce our vulnerability so that we become more resilient to the impacts of climate change. And so developing countries, our attention has been drawn to adaptation, how we could actually help to address our adaptation needs. But it shows, evidence shows that if you look at 2 degrees scenario, developing countries require more than 100 billion. That is even for both mitigation and adaptation. In terms of adaptation, developing countries require over 140 to 300 billion to address the adaptation needs by 2030. And this amount is even above, like I said, the 100 billion that is required, which shows that as we head into 2030, the reality is that even the amount that is being mobilized, which is below the 100 billion, will not even be enough for the to address adaptation. And as I indicated earlier, as from the data, COVID impacts on economies will actually reduce the quantum flow moving forward. Now, there was a study done by the United Nations Environmental Program, and they look at the stimulus package of countries to revamp most economies due to the impact of COVID. And they wanted to see whether, even as we are recovering from COVID, with the money we are using to revamp our economies, how much we are targeting on NDCs, especially for developing countries. And it shows that not much is even being devoted as we move forward towards adaptation. And most of the stimulus package has not been actually used to address the NDCs as we look at it. And some of these monies are also debt. So moving forward, the rate at which we service our debts, as I showed earlier, will also increase, because during COVID, the IMF actually rolled out a rapid credit facility where a lot of developing countries went in for that. And most of them will mature, I think, from 2024 or so. And so developing countries will have to still be servicing this debt, coupled with lower revenue generation. And so even with the stimulus package to revamp economies, the monies didn't go even into climate related areas, and which is a big issue for us. If you look at this map, the real climate related areas are in the green, and as you can see from there, only few countries, you can even count them, which actually use their stimulus package to address climate related issues. A lot of the countries, including my own country, didn't do that, and it is something which will affect our ability to achieve our NDCs moving forward. And in Ghana now, currently, due to the impacts of COVID and our government's ability to not actually mobilize enough revenue, there has been 20% cuts for all government institutions. So even institutions that are actually relevant when it comes to our NDCs or our adaptation related programs will suffer lower revenue now to be able to undertake certain activities that they will normally undertake. And this is the reality that is facing us in the short to medium term. And why we need to prioritize adaptation on the NDCs, as I mentioned earlier, developing countries are most vulnerable, and because the impact of climate change is always occurring, even though we've set policy action areas we want to achieve relative to the NDCs, the impact of climate change, it hasn't stopped. It will continue to impact on us. So our needs towards adaptation will continue to increase moving forward. So if we even require, let's say, 500 billion to address adaptation based on estimates we've done now, because the impact of climate change is always occurring, the scenarios we've even do now may actually be more as we head towards the future. And also there are challenges with measuring adaptation projects. They are also in the, this cliche that we all say that adaptation programs are unbankable, which means sometimes they don't have commercial value. And so it's difficult to actually attract enough finance to actually address policy action areas. And relative to that, when you look at mitigations projects are normally more of sometimes of commercial value than adaptation projects. So with all these challenges that we are facing, it is important that we rethink the way we've actually developed our NDCs, and how, even though they are of priority to us, the challenges are that moving forward, there may be external scenarios we cannot ever say. For example, nobody expected COVID to come and to impact world economies like that. As the world was recovering, there was a war in Russia and Ukraine, which is also affecting a lot of countries. And you never know, there may be more. We pray against it, but it is likely if any other pandemic or some kind of scenario occurs, these challenges may surmount and it will even increase and it will even exacerbate the current situation we are facing. And so as we develop the NDCs, it's time to rethink how we can actually, even though it's a priority area, how we can actually rank them based on the limited resources that we have and to be able to address issues that could make a vast impact on us. And that is what this whole thing I want us to think about is about. I want all of us to share ideas on about our NDCs. They are all we've listed policy action area. We feel it's important for us to address our tackle most of our climate change related issues. But the fact of the matter is that resources will be limited. The monies we are expecting to flow for developing countries from developed countries will not materialize. And as we move forward, we should be able to say that in the short to medium term, if let's say Ghana requires 9 billion and it has 1 billion, it's able to maybe attract 1 billion. Which of the priority areas should that 1 billion go? That is what I want us to consider. If Ghana expects or if Kenya expects 60 billion and is able to mobilize just 10 billion, which of the priority areas Kenya has listed should the 10 billion go? And so I think moving forward, there should be a need for a metrics or something like an indicator to be able to rank our priority areas so that we feel that in the short to medium term, if we invest in this area, it will actually have the needed impacts on our economies and on our climate change resilience approach than, let's say, if we invest in this area, which is also of a priority, because that is the challenge we are facing in the short to medium term. And so I came out with this. It is not an end to itself. It is not based on any robust analysis, or let's say it is based on sometimes the underlying issues that researchers and policymakers use to develop some of the NDCs, and also sometimes based on literatures on a lot of issues that has been addressed with regards to our NDCs. And so if we are able to develop that metrics and actually harmonize it, then we can say that, within this policy area, we will have to actually rank it as our most important, then the second, then the third, then the fourth, looking at these 5 parameters as I have chosen. It could be more, it could be less, depending on whichever area we think will align with our NDCs and make it more focused between the short to medium term, making sure that with the limited resources we have, if we are able to put money here, it will have an impact on our economies and our citizens within the short term to medium term. And so I look at, for example, alignment with national goals and sectors. So if we take our NDC priority, especially with adaptation, as I said, so we will look at all the areas that we submitted, and we will examine that whether between all the areas that we submitted, if Ghana has 11 adaptation policy action areas, which of them actually, in terms of our national development goals, actually addresses the most pertinent issues. And so if we feel that policy action area A actually rank higher than the other, then we know that if we get some limited resources, we will actually be able to, in the short to medium term, have the necessary impact. Then we can look at the financial feasibility. As I read earlier, the reality is that the world economy is in a challenge. Developing countries are feeling most of the brunt of the impact of COVID and other related issues. And so most of the resources that we require, the monies we've stated associated with the policy action areas, we have to check whether is it visible, is it feasible for us to be able to attract such monies. And so that should also be taken into consideration when we are actually ranking some of our NDCs. That is it real? Can we actually attract this type of finance or this type of funds to address the NDCs? Then we can also look at market and technology potential, where we can look at the fact that the NDCs, not all the NDCs will have such vast approach of attracting the needed investments from the private, because already it is established that governments will not have enough revenue to address the NDC. So how do we ensure that if we rank them, this particular area within the short to medium term can attract private investments into the sector, said that there's huge potential for markets and technology to be able to attract private sector. Then we can also look at its contribution to sustainable development, and in assessing that, we could also look at whether the NDCs has a rippling effect on the other sectors of the economy. So, for example, if you take, if you are investing in the agri sector, apart from the fact that if it's an adaptation, you are creating climate smart agricultural process, it provides nutrition for the population, which improves health outcome, and which actually also can create jobs. So we should look at how, if we are ranking them, how we can incorporate the contribution to sustainable development in the short to medium term. Then also the mitigation components of the ND. So if we harmonize all this process or these metrics as I've indicated, we could be able to say, okay, if we invest this A amounts, which is very limited. I mean, we struggle to get A amounts into this. If we're able to mobilize A amounts into this, we should be able to actually have an impact in the short to medium term relative to just looking at addressing all the areas at a time. And so if Ghana or Kenya or let's say Mauritius are able to attract a limited amount of funds, looking at the fact that they should be able to have a situation where the funds will be able to spur socioeconomic growth in the country, whilst addressing the NDCs. And so once socioeconomic growth improve, the country GDP improve, and in the long term, it will help with revenue mobilization to address the rest. And that is what I want us to address our minds to with this presentation. So for example, I took some of the Ghana priority areas. So with adaptation, Ghana wants to address early warning and disaster risk management, and for example, and citywide resilience planning. So with all the challenges facing us and the need to also prioritize between these two, if Ghana has limited resources, which of them will make the impacts more in the short to medium term? That will actually help the country mobilize enough resources to address the next indicators, and so the next policy action area, And so that is one of the areas I would like us to also consider as we are thinking about matrices or ranking our NDCs moving forward. Another one, let's say integrated water resource management and building resilience for agriculture and landscape food systems. Between these two, which are all important, like I said, but based on the challenges that we are facing, it will be prudent that we rank them and say that, okay, if you're able to at least invest in this area in the short to medium term, as and when enough resources come in, we can address this area. So between the two, which one of them will make the necessary impact moving forward? And so if I take the agricultural sector, for example, in Ghana, it provides livelihood for 70% of the population and contribute to 19% of our GDP. It forms part of our, in terms of micro, small, and medium scale enterprises, it's actually provide jobs for majority of people in the informal sector. And evidence shows that the agri sector also, if you're able to manage it well, it's actually is able to reduce greenhouse gas emission by more than half. So if Ghana has limited resources, even though we want to address water management, water resource management as our NDCs, will it be prudent to invest in the agriculture sector, which is the backbone of our economy, or the water resource? So this is something we can think about moving forward regards to our challenges as Africans or as developing countries, and our ability to attract the needed finance to address our NDCs. Yeah. All right. Thank you. I welcome any questions, contribution, and also a discussion on the our priority areas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Obed. That was an in-depth presentation, and I'm really happy to see the points where we need to really discuss and see how we can strategically position Africa to be able to access the NDC financing, and also just to know where exactly do we need to tap into. And I also like the way you have brought in the aspect of COVID-19 and how it had impacts on our NDCs. So at this point, allow me to welcome our convener, Dr. Johannes Atala, if he has a word or two before we can open the floor to our participants. Thank you very much, Dr. Atala.
Thanks, Juliet. I actually do not have much to say, just to congratulate Obed for this kind of strategic thinking, because we are all aware that the biggest challenge that African countries face today with regards to climate action relates to financing. Over 50% of the NDC commitments that African countries have submitted actually pegged on conditional funding, in the sense that most of the actions can only be undertaken if there is adequate and appropriate international funding. So the financial gaps with regards to climate action in Africa is really a major, area which needs a lot of thinking. And as stakeholders, I think as we gear towards COP27, the COP27 in Egypt, one of the major fundamental question is, what are the options to fill this particular financial gap? What are the pathways through which this particular challenge can be addressed? There are many opportunities that are emerging. We see a lot of public-private partnerships that are coming up. We see multilateral development banks really coming in very strongly to also be supportive in this process. We see emergence of a number of innovative financial instruments, basically trying to also fill that gap. But again, the question around, how relevant are all this to the African context? How useful or how inclusive, how equitable can these particular options, emerging options, basically address the gap that we have? Because one of the main challenge that Africa continues to face is that a lot of our communities are really highly vulnerable, and a lot of the financial systems that have been established at the global level, the global financial infrastructure, has not necessarily addressed or aligned very well to these particular ideas around equitable financing, appropriate financing, much more aligned financing. So in the current system, a lot of marginalized communities, and of course, different social groups are still left out of the financial discourse. So while we try to address the impacts of climate change, the people who are supposed to, get much of the support, whose adaptive capacity ought to be enhanced, the vulnerable groups, still really remain outside the peripheries of the current financial systems at the global level. But even if it comes to the national level, we see a lot of exclusion still, because the infrastructure or the structures at the national systems have also not been well developed to be able to take into account the needs of the different groups, especially the local communities. So a lot of funding that basically comes to the national level, relatively end up just being used, a lot of times, at the national platforms. Very limited amount trickles down to the local communities where action is needed. So there is really a lot of work that needs to be done. And as stakeholders, I think what Obed is already trying to bring in here is that how do we think about prioritization? How do we think about what are the most important things with the limited resources? That is just one part of the question. There's the bigger part of the question is, how do we shift the climate financial systems at different levels to be able to speak or to be able to be more equitable and address issues, vulnerabilities that really is what this finance is meant to address. How do we address issues to do with justice, just transition to more sustainable economy? So these are debates which are emerging, and I think the COP27 provides a platform that we begin to really think critically about some of these issues. I just wanted to highlight this, but I think the thought process that has been presented is a good step already contributing to some of these discussions moving forward. Thank you, Juliet. I'm really interested to listen to the discussion. If I have other points, I'll come back to make comments and contribute. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Taylor. And now I open the floor to all our participants to feel free to add, give in your contributions in terms of comments and questions to the just concluded presentation. I'll also be keeping an eye on the chat. So if you're not able to speak, can they put your comment in the chat?
Juliet, there's a number of already some comments on the chat. Maybe could be raised as others think about the questions.
Okay, so I can see a comment from Olivia. And she says, thank you, Obed, for the insights and information. I would like to know where gender and marginalized groups would be categorized in the metric of prioritization. This question is premised on the fact that climate impacts vary across gender, and also addressing these impacts either through NDCs and NAPs will require specific attention. Thank you, Olivia, for your question. And
okay. Thank you. So regards to Olivia's question, like I said, this, as Dr. Teller said, these are things we should think about moving forward in the short to medium term, and especially as we approach COP27. This, the metrics I talked about, like when I was saying, it is not exhaustive. As she said, climate change impacts on women, and they are the most, in terms of gender, they are the most vulnerable. And so if you look at most NDCs, they actually have, in terms of how they've actually categorized the NDCs, they indicate whether there is an incorporation of gender issues in the policy action areas. And so regards to the NDCs itself has that kind of incorporation of ensuring that gender issues are addressed in all the policy action areas as far as possible. Not all of them actually have explicitly mentioned gender-related issues, but as far as possible, they actually make it, it is recommended that they make it gender responsive as much as possible. And so relative to what I'm proposing is that as we think about how we are addressing the NDCs or implementing our NDCs relative to the limited resources that we have, we cannot, the fact is that we cannot actually mobilize what we expect to mobilize, looking at the global phenomenon that is happening. And so if we decide that, okay, if we invest in, let's say, the agricultural sector, if you have limited resources and invest in the agricultural sector, which, for example, in Ghana, it serves as livelihood for more than half of the population. Women, a lot of women are also in the agri sector. And so will it have that kind of rippling effect on the socioeconomic development of the country than, let's say, I'm not saying those other action areas are not important, but let's say if we decide to invest in maybe water resource management or another area, which maybe in the short term, we will not see that kind of socioeconomic drive. And because we need also the socioeconomic drive in the country to be able to mobilize resources to address all the NDCs. And that is something we can think about as we move into a territory of changing our landscape of financing of our NDCs. Yeah, thank you.
thank you, Obed. So I'd like to ask Vincent Oji to kindly unmute and ask your question. Vincent, if you can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you very much. Okay, my question would be, based on the paper presented, would Obed suggest a technology need assessment sectorially and regionally, so that given the paucity of funds for NDCs, these things can be maximized for African countries? Will you suggest a technology needs assessment? Thank you.
Thank you, Vincent, for your question. So I'll go ahead and take another question from Oscar, and then Obed will respond to the first three. So Oscar Ibalu, kindly unmute and ask a question or give a comment.
Good afternoon from Nairobi, Kenya. Thank you very much, Obed, for your very elaborate presentation. For me, I think it's the right way to go about realizing financial resources through the NDC contributions. So my observation in the last few months is that there is a lot of tools out there in various organizations. Some people are trying to integrate disaster risk reduction into climate change adaptation. Some organizations are trying to cascade down and address issues of urban risk resilience building, urban risk management. Other organizations are looking at how climate change, the impact of climate change is exacerbates vulnerability in fragile states. And they all seem to be developing different types of metrics and rankings to be able to help them measure vulnerability of communities and to help them in the decision-making processes for how they're going to be able to carry out climate change adaptation. So for me, personally, I see there is a disconnect between planning with regards to the national determined contributions and policy and implementation at the localized level, specifically focusing on informal settlements. I think there's a group of people who are being left behind. Climate change adaptation, climate mitigation hasn't really been the main focus of very many organizations, specifically when it comes to informal settlements. So I just wanted to tease this out and see what Obed thinks with relation to how are we going to move forward, and what also Dr. Atela spoke about, forming development pathways for funding and fundraising. How do you move forward and develop a metric system whereby the needs of those in informal settlements, specifically through slum upgrading programs, are met?
Thank you very much, Oscar. And I think maybe let's not just have Obed responding to the questions, but if anyone among us, the participants, would like to also kind of respond to any of the questions asked, kindly feel free to come in. In the meantime, let me welcome Obed to respond to the questions that have been addressed so far.
Okay, thank you very much, Juliet. The first question has to do with whether technology tools should be part of the approach that's we can use to prioritize some of our NDCs in terms of the ranking system. I believe so, and I think I mentioned that in the market and technology potential, that's in terms of how we look at our NDCs and with the limited finance that we faced, and how we are also trying to re-engineer our financial system to be able to attract the needed finance to address our NDCs. We should look at how private, especially private investments, can be harmonized very well within the NDCs, how we can actually be able to attract private investments to address our NDCs, because it's a fact that government's revenue cannot actually meet some of the NDCs that government itself have set out. And so how government is able to develop regulatory framework or policies to attract the needed investments looking at the potential, because the private sector, especially when it comes to adaptation, if the project is unbankable and is not able to generate the needed revenue, the private sector ability to be able to come and address those areas will be a challenge, because they will be looking at profit. So how do governments actually develop an approach to integrate, especially market or technology potential within the NDCs, to be able to attract the needed private investments in our NDCs to address them? And so I think it's a critical area as we think about it, as we do our policy analysis, as we do our research to look into that area. The next question has to do with a lot of tools that is out there, and I recognize that there's a lot of tools that incorporate, especially sometimes disaster risk reduction approach in terms of our climate related issues. And all these metrics are important, but what we should also address our minds to is that if we're incorporating our metrics in developing some of our policy action areas, how does it impact in the short to medium? That is the grasp of what I'm actually saying. How does it ensure that your resources, which is a challenge now, which is not available, how do you ensure that, first of all, you even attract the private sector into that kind of policy action area? And how do you ensure that it actually propels socioeconomic growth in your country, to be able to improve your growth, ensure higher revenue generation, to be able to implement other action areas that you want to do? And that is how we should think. If any metrics is that you think can actually help to address those action areas, those are the areas I want us to address our minds to moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Obed. I can see a comment from Dr. Luvi. He says he's about to attend to another meeting. So I think it would be nice to know whether maybe you'd like to come in and give your comments before you go. Dr. Luvi? Can't seem to get him. Let me allow Paul Tando to come in next. Paul, please.
Thank you very much for your time. Obed, that's a fine presentation. I'm Paul in Kumasi, Ghana, a lecturer at the University of University of Science and Technology. So, Obed, I think this is a fine presentation. My comment is on how our institutions also leveraging on these NDCs, because a big university like ARIN University, the SDGs are there. Last year when we did our summer school, there were issues on the SDGs. And one of the key indicators of the SDG is to ensure that we have sustainability in terms of food, supply, and what has come to do with it. And then also the issue of climate change. So the question is, what role are these institutions, for example, the universities and other stakeholders, leveraging, particularly for Ghana, and what is the access rate of the amount that are available to the country? Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, for the question. Let me also have Mary. Mary, please, if you can hear me, kindly unmute and go ahead and speak. Mary Raya. All right, I can't get Mary. Let me invite Michael Onchabo. Michael Onchabo, kindly unmute and ask your question.
Hi, Juliet. I'm in a bit noisy place. Not sure whether I'll be very clear, but I just had a concern around, the discussion around informal settlements, and I'm aware that in our neighboring countries, for example, in Somalia, we've seen evidence of migrations as a result of extended droughts and hunger, leading to coming up and mushrooming of informal settlements, and that is as a direct result of effects of climate change. Absolutely. So, just wondering, like I work for an NGO. Of course, we always look for funding to support smallholder farmers or forest communities. And I was just loudly wondering, like, do we have organizations or development partners or governments that are purposely budgeting and thinking about securing funding for such insurgencies? Because this is a reality that probably will not be running away from, and that will be coming up and catching up with us very soon.
Thank you, Michael. And yes, we could hear you despite the noise at the background. So I'll invite Charles Tonui. Charles, please, you can come in.
Yeah, thanks, Obed, for that presentation. I'm Charles Tanoi, and Policy and Impact Specialist at the Africa Research and Impact Network, and currently pursuing a PhD on SDG governance, polycentric SDG governance. And one of the principles that I'm focusing on is the realignment of the donor priorities with the national priorities. And my question, when you touch on one of the metrics, is the realignment with the national and the sector priorities. And did you manage to identify the alignment and misalignment, especially for the case that you presented on agriculture? And if there was alignment, especially, were there any policy provisions in the existing policies that will support the implementation of the provisions within the revised NDC? If there was misalignment, maybe what will be some of the recommendation that you can provide from this particular study? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Charles. So I'll just read this comment from Mary, and then I'll invite Obed to respond to the questions. So Mary says, thanks, Obed, for a robust contribution. For Africa to achieve its climate change adaptation agenda, Africa needs to adopt a holistic approach to attracting international funding as well as internal funding by engaging the private sector. Partnership remains imperative. Africa must therefore take a steep change, have a shared budget as well as SDGs-based budget. Africa's major challenges are notably adaptation, mitigation, and finance. And I see another comment right from Mary again. She says, Africa must underscore on the need to leverage on the private sector and international finance. I commend the Africa Development Bank and the Global Center for Adaptation for spearheading the African Adaptation Acceleration Program. Thank you very much, Mary, for your comments. Please allow me to welcome Obed to respond to the questions.
Okay. Thank you very much for all the questions. And so I'll pick the first question, which came from, I think, Paul, who asked about how institutions can actually leverage on the NDCs to be able to actually implement some of them or attract the needed financing. And I think it's one of the loopholes with our governance system that we have, especially with how institutions are being formed and being asked to operate. Most of the times, it depends. Ghana, for example, we run a centralized government systems, and so where resources are being channeled, or whoever is leading in terms of resource generation or regulatory framework, we expect the central government to be able to do those things for us. But institutions can actually leverage on some of the things they do to be able to mobilize enough resources to address some of the NDCs we've actually implemented. For example, in Ghana, we have the local government system, where apart from allocations from the central governments, which helps the metropolitan municipal district assemblies to be able to implement our program, they also generate an IGF, internally generated funds, from some levies and some things they charge on local people or local activities that goes on in their districts. Those monies are retained by the assemblies, but time and time again, some of these monies are not being looked at in terms of how we can ensure that even with our NDCs, how some of this IGF, which doesn't go to central governments, the district assemblies are able to utilize them very effectively to address some of our NDCs. And for example, so if issues with climate smart agriculture, how do the IGF that is generated by the district assemblies should be able to address those areas instead of just relying on central government, who is constrained by resources and who has to go and borrow. And I think Paul's comment is very, very timely. And how do we ensure that we re-engineer the way we actually mobilize even our resources, and even the resources we generate? How do we ensure that we utilize them effectively in a way that it doesn't overburden central governments? Because central governments, because of, like I said, the challenge, they will actually look for more debt, sometimes with these green bonds and stuff, to be able to address some of the NDCs. Whilst there are enough generation of monies within the district assemblies, which actually will affect local people in communities. How do we ensure that those resources that are generated at the districts can be leveraged to address some of the NDCs internally, which will be more effective moving forward? Then I think Michael's comment was more of a contribution. So I will handle the next comment on the realignments, whether in terms of the agricultural sector, relative to the INDCs and the updated NDC, whether they are realignment. I'll use Ghana's one as an example. When we submitted our INDCs, we were operating a national policy, which was the Ghana Shared Growth and Development Agenda 2, and that was what was driving development policy action areas in Ghana. It ended, and so Ghana, we have elections after every 4 years. It ended with the previous government. A new government came and they had the consolidated program for action, which their focus was on the agricultural sector. And so our new NDCs, updated NDCs, were more focused on the agricultural sector as opposed to the INDCs. And so government try to realign some of the issues to fit into their what we call consolidated program for action. And so sometimes it depends on the country's policy, whether it's fiscal, monetary, or it's a general policy, how they are able to realign some of their NDCs, looking at the condition that exists within the countries as they move forward. And so that is why I want the NDCs not to become like, do I say, a Bible where you can't change anything in it. I think we should be able to become innovative as we move forward. We should be able to make adjustments and should be able to find a way of judiciously allocating resources to the NDCs. Thank you. I think I have addressed the questions. I don't know. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Obed. I don't know if we have any more questions, or does anyone like to come in? Yes, I can see Paul raising his hand. Yes, Paul, please go ahead.
Yeah. Sorry, thank you, Obed, for your response. I'm grateful. But a quick one, which probably could be a general comment in view of the global situation. If you look at Ghana, for example, our situation in terms of fertilizer importation is a big issue now because of the Russia-Ukraine war. And some of these fertilizers, the active ingredients and materials that are used are all imported. So it's really having a big impact on agriculture within the country within this year. So as a continent, what is the way forward? Because if we are going climate smart agriculture, then we need to think about simple ways of reducing the CO2s by using things that will really be easily adaptable within our communities. Composting and raising simple means of getting some of these manure within the locality to limit some of these importations, which one reduces our foreign exchange, and then also having issues now that there are wars. We don't know how it will turn out. So it also will keep us thinking in terms of policies and also decisions we make. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for the comment. I don't know if you, Obed, you'd like to make any comments.
Okay, thank you very much. So Paul's comments is also timely, looking at, so it's all fit into the discussions we are having, like looking inwards instead of outward, how we can actually find innovative ways of attracting needed investment, realign some of our programs, taking some initiatives ourselves to be able to address some of our challenges related to climate change. And I'm always advocate for inward looking, not like maybe not considering other countries, but always looking inwards for solutions rather than looking on the global stage. I think I said it at the NDC Academy Forum, that majority of the supposed climate finance that's trickle down to developing countries are all non-concessionary loans. These are debts that add to the books of developing countries. And in the long term, it doesn't actually help developing countries as we think it should, because as I showed earlier, most of the countries are using majority of their, or 1/3 or sometimes 2/3 of their national revenue to service those debts. And so some critical areas that they are supposed to actually address in terms of climate change, or sometimes relevant areas like agriculture, is not actually being done. And so, like a vicious cycle, they also have to go and borrow to undertake those projects. And it actually doesn't help African countries or developing countries in the long term. And so I think as we think about resources, we should find a way of looking at how we can do certain things for ourselves, strengthening our institutions, looking at our regulatory framework, sometimes our tax regime, and how we can also attract the private sector, giving them the right incentive to be able to move into those sectors to address some of our climate action areas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Obed. I'm not sure if I'm locking out anyone with any comment or question. All right, looks like we don't have any more questions and comments. So at this point, I think we've come to the end of the discussion, but the conversation does not stop here. So I'd just like to notify all our participants present here today that we have lined up a number of sessions on innovative climate finance and capacity in Africa as pre-COPs, and also during the Africa Climate Week. So I would really like to have you as part of these conversations. And therefore, at this point, I would like to request us to be on the lookout on all our social media pages, on Facebook at the Africa Research and Impact Network. Also follow us on Twitter at ARIN_Africa, on LinkedIn at Africa Research and Impact Network. Also, just to let you know that this recording will be shared with all of you after this session ends. So thank you very much, Obed Asamoah. Obed is one of our fellows and the beneficiaries of the NDC FFP. FFP is a finance fellowship program that happened right in Kenya, coordinated by the ARIN and Frankfurt School. So we are very proud of the work that you are doing, and together with other fellows, and we look forward to having many of such discussions. As we close, I would kindly request all of us to turn on our videos, or if you're able to turn on your video for the last photo session. Obed, kindly stop sharing so that we can have a full view. Thank you very much. Give 2 more minutes. All right, thank you very much. So we can smile for the photo, and our media team will be taking it shortly. Good. Thank you very much, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you again next Friday. Have a restful weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.